In trying to create some logic to the sequence of panels on issues that are really international in character and global in character, I thought we should start with maybe the observation that Christopher Columbus and not Thomas Friedman was right. The world is round, not flat. And there are a whole array of interesting developments. Globalization is really a sequence of national stories played out on a larger stage. For those of you who wonder where the word globalization came from, for some of us in mid-career, the word had been internationalization. It was the international economy, and suddenly it became global. We went from the international world, which was really bipolar. It was not, I mean, that is, was Russia and the Soviet Union on the outside, North America and Europe, to a tripolar world, the Trilateral Commission. And really, with the rise of Japan, the word global really came with it. So, in fact, it was that national story in entering on the global stage that really, the world stage that changed the labeling. And the question is, what difference does that all make? And how do we create a sequence of conversations here today? Our focus in this panel is going to be both on the character of that globalization and the impact of the rise of a knowledge economy and the changing structures of power and politics on the university and the context the university operates in. We've already talked a bit about Africa. We've been talking about international dimensions. And when one focuses on the global, two important things stand out in the university context. One is really the rise of Asia, not just the emergence now of China and India, but also very powerfully the forgotten giant, which is Japan, which in real economic and technological terms remains the powerhouse, and the changing structures of power relations and ambition that represents. And in the European side, the emergence of, we're at the 50th anniversary of CSHE and the 50th anniversary of the European Union at the same moment. The changing character of that project, of the European project, the effort to create a European community, an identity, a research focus, and at the same time maintain national identities and national excellences and the reforms that are involved. So in that broader context, about a globalization context, we're going to follow the following pattern. The biographies of the people are actually in the materials that you have. So let me just say we're going to go in the following sequence. Professor Martin Kenny from Davis is going to give us a background about knowledge and patents in and the like in an emerging global economy to try and set the context in which the university is now operating. He will then stamp his foot and stalk out, refusing to take questions because he has to go teach at Davis this afternoon. So he'll leave here when he needs to leave without. Then we will turn to Professor Henry Etkovitz. We were practicing his name a bit earlier, who in fact will give us a view of the future of the university and the university of the future set in this global context. Then I will turn to Alison Bernstein, who from a philanthropist vantage will give us some musings and some ideas on choices that the universities need to make in the future and we need to make about universities. And then end with a Cal alum who left Cal and went down toward Stanford, but still lives in Berkeley and started a small computer company with some friends. And he will chat a bit with us about the wandering scholar in an internet age and what the meaning of all that is for the university. So with that, let me turn to Martin. We're going to try and keep each of the presentations at 12 to 15 minutes, and I'm sitting here at this spot so that I can actually pull on people and try and hold them within bounds.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to talk a little bit about how entrepreneurship, venture capital, and patenting is starting to change in the global economy, because I think that these changes, if they continue upon the path that I'm going to give you some data points on, are going to change where American, where European, where the traditional centers of university excellence are I believe will change, or at least this will set the context for you to think about it. So thank you very much, Judd and John, for inviting me to speak. So this is just a picture of a small fishing village in China, Shenzhen. It's a little hard to see in 1985, 1995, and then 2000. It's the same picture taken at three different points in time, sort of showing you that there's been a little change in the global economy and where economic activity is. This is just a picture of the Infosys campus. This is not a very nice picture of a very beautiful campus that has about 10,000 Infosys employees. So what's the outline? I'm going to talk about patents. I'm going to talk about where is corporate R&D being done, where is venture capital investment being done, and then just a brief picture of India, which will give you an idea of where large amounts of think work are moving to. Okay, this is just USPTO data on patents. You can see the United States up there, about 85,000 patents per year. Not much change. This is on a log scale, so there has been some change. There below that is Japan, coming up in the 60s on a log scale again, and then leveling off in the 90s. Then you have below that Taiwan and Korea having their growth probably starting to level off. A little hard to say, but they look like they're leveling off. Mexico is down there at about 100, has stayed at 100 in patenting since 1963, no change. The Germans, the Europeans would all be up there between 10,000 and 100,000, basically no change. And the final lines down below are India and China, sort of starting to appear in the global patenting arena and moving up, taking a similar path to Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. So if we look at USPTO patents per 10,000 persons, Taiwan's 2.5, about like the United States, Korea a little lower, Japan 2.7, 2.8, and then we have India and China, 0.000. If this changes in any significant way over the same kind of time frame that we saw in Taiwan and Korea, they are going to be important patenters in the world economy. So where is R&D being done? I just took this from the Economist Intelligence Unit. This came out about 3 or 4 days ago, asking executives, 300 executives from global Fortune 1000 firms. I got a response rate of about 30%. Which of the following countries would you choose as being best overall overseas locations for research and development? Don't select your own country. India is really big. Now that's, of course, the US is very India-oriented, but that just shows you China's next, and the rest of these countries are sort of not seen as significant now. Now, many of them already have the research units from the global multinationals, but just showing you where corporations are thinking about this. In which country is the highest proportion of your overseas R&D budget currently concentrated? United States of America, India, China. Now, these are very big countries, but this is a very big difference from 15 years ago. Extraordinarily large difference. And I'll talk a little bit more about India because India is really starting to play an important role in the global R&D environment. So, venture capital. We here are in the Valley, or not quite the Valley, but the Bay Area, are extraordinarily blessed with a lot of venture capital and a great deal of entrepreneurship. How is this changing over time? And what I have on the top is, these are all in billions of dollars, the 2005 investments. And you can see Silicon Valley, $7.7 billion. It is the largest concentration of venture capital investing in the world. What I direct your attention to is on the other side, where you have China as tied with Israel and India in 2005, below UK and below, basically beyond that, Germany, France, they all would be below those three at 1.1 billion. What I'd like to direct your attention to is the newest 2006 data, which this is the US. I didn't break out Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley still would be 30 to 35 to 40% of US venture capital investing. But I would direct your attention to China now as the second largest destination investment of venture capital in the world. It's past the UK. India's below that, but coming up. Then there's UK and Israel. It's quite likely that the Chinese numbers will continue to grow, and very soon we'll see the Indian numbers, given the trajectory of investment of venture capital in India, which is really only about 2 years old. The trajectory will take them above Israel and the UK within 2 years, most likely, unless, of course, we have economic catastrophe or something. But given the trends, given the sort of startups you're seeing, that's what's happening. That's telling us, in a sense, that venture capitalists, these people who invest in new firms, are starting to see new opportunities. 80% of the Chinese venture capital investment is from international firms, many of them from the Valley. Now, we could talk a little bit more if we have time about what is the exact nature of what's being invested in China and in India, but this is a redirection of where this kind of investment activity is going to occur. Okay, this is a little bit hard to see. This is a 2006 study that asked venture-backed firms were interviewed and asked, where are the top locations for your R&D? Okay, where are you doing R&D? So this is the sons of today, or the sons of today, or the Googles of today. And what you see is the US companies in research and development and engineering. The blue is India. Okay. For R&D, and this is again outside of your country, just shows where the US companies are looking. The European companies are a little bit different, looking at Eastern Europe for their R&D and their engineering. But again, India, very powerful. If you look at manufacturing, that's the yellow line. That's exactly what you'd expect, China. The APAC, Asia Pacific, again, India is very high. And the other Americas, that would be Canada in essence. What this shows, again, is where are venture capital-backed firms starting to do their R&D. And this is becoming a very common phenomenon. Startup Silicon Valley firm, by the time it has a headcount of 20 or 30, starts an R&D operation in India or China, India in particular, or China. So what that's saying is that they're going to start growing their headcount rather than all here in the Bay Area or in Boston. They're going to start growing a lot of their headcount in India, which is a kind of an interesting phenomenon. We used to think of I don't know if John could tell us, what headcount did you start to go outside Silicon Valley? 1,000?
We're now 35,000, so we probably were at about 1,000 before we began to hire in China and India.
Yeah. So this is a dramatic difference. You're much earlier in the growth phase of a venture capital-backed firm. Are you going to do stuff overseas? And it's not just the manufacturing piece, it's the R&D piece, or at least the D part of R&D. And we could have a discussion of different strategies that firms are using, small startups are using. But this gives you a little bit of an idea of how that component of where our educated graduates are going to be able to go. Okay. This is a visual representation of the Indian service provision sector. This is all services, R&D and everything, in 1995. Now, I have a whole bunch of snapshots. This is a stylized depiction, but I just would like to skip to today, right? Indian headcount in services and in R&D services in India is growing between 35 to 40% a year. Now, we know that can't grow that way forever, but clearly, for the next 2 or 3 years, that seems pretty reasonable. All I would direct your attention to is this is a value added on one axis, number of employees, so the size on the other axis, and the types of different activities on the Z axis, okay? And what you see is a proliferation of activities, and we all know this from finance, et cetera, medical, or maybe you don't know it. If you don't, I'm happy to send you a paper that analyzes this in greater detail. But you have IC chip design, packaged software, R&D, high value added activities now being done in India. P&L for PageMaker, for Adobe, the P&L profit and loss responsibility is now located in India. It's not located in San Jose. It's located in India. So you're starting to see India taking larger and larger pieces of the value-added pie. And I just use India. Russia would be another example, Eastern Europe, China. But India is really the iconic and largest of these. This is just employment in India by selected large non-Indian software firms. And the only numbers I would like you to pay attention to here are the percentage of global employment now in India. IBM percentage now is 18% of global employment. They're at 60,000. By 2010, they've announced they'll be at 100,000 employees in India. These are all graduates. None of these are high school graduates or janitors or things like this. This is mainly graduates. Oracle is a little less at 20%. Adobe's less at 13%. Microsoft is low but growing very quickly at 7%. All of these firms are at this point growing their headcount at about 30% a year. Now, how long can this go given the Indian university system and its ability to educate? A lot of open questions here, but it shows that these corporations now are thinking about the educated workforce of the world in really a profound way. It's different even than 10 or 15 years ago when IBM had a lab in Zurich, et cetera, et cetera. And you're starting to see centers of excellence for these firms being started in countries like India, which is, I think, which will change the global configuration of where the demand for educated people will be. And it may be everywhere, but it may be that our educated students will start to compete in wages with Indian educated students. We might see that in the IT space relatively soon. Just, again, data points that for people like you who are really thinking about where the university is going to have to evolve, these data points, I think, are something to bring in. Okay, so closing thoughts. India in particular and China and Eastern Europe, particularly for the Europeans, are new and important locations for R&D, for global R&D. That the venture capital industry now is global. The benefits of having it just here and our graduates getting the advantage, that's no longer the way the game works. U.S. university graduates can no longer be guaranteed, and maybe this is a little bit of a projection, good jobs simply because they're located here. It's a very nice thing that we in the developed world had for a very long time. That's no longer going to be that way. The location for think work jobs in some way, in some sense, it's not to say the Bay Area or Boston won't do very well, but is up for grabs in a way that it certainly wasn't 20 years ago or 30 years ago whenever I was a student. It's hard to remember when that was. So with that, I was very fast. I'm through. Thank you.
My title is the Future of the University and the University of the Future. And basically, taking off from some of the data points that Martin mentioned. And if we take seriously that we're now in a knowledge-based society, then the university plays a much more important role in society, not only as the producer of trained persons, but also generating the knowledge that becomes the basis of firms. The entrepreneurial university, in many ways, starts at MIT. Land-grant university, it's not as well known, but 1/3 of the Massachusetts land grant went to establish MIT, along with funds from local industrialists at a time when the Boston region was the major industrial center of the United States. But as a professor from the University of Virginia in a rural area who had the concept for MIT as a science-based technological university that would infuse new ideas and technology from basic research into industry. But it was a small teaching college for many years, and as it began research, it drew in professors from industry who became the first researchers at MIT. But MIT, as it developed, also began to develop humanities departments of a special character, oriented towards technology. And why was this? At the time, Harvard had offered to merge with MIT, but MIT kept its independence, but trained engineers in a broader way than was conventional, on the belief that engineers with a liberal arts training would rise to the top of the firms, and so that MIT graduates would be the CEOs, rather than working for Harvard graduates with their broad-based liberal arts education. And we can see a similar evolution at Stanford, we may say the second entrepreneurial university. And so the entrepreneurial university incorporates both the ivory tower and Humboldtian models as it takes on this mission of generating knowledge and firms. And the future independence of the university, I think, will also be based on this generation of income from this knowledge. If you look at the current figures, it's still relatively small. On the other hand, I first set forth this thesis in 1983, well before there was evidence such as the Google IPO. And I spent a half year in the OTL at Stanford when it was announced that the IPO had taken place and Stanford would get $200 million or $300 million from this. I also interviewed someone in the management corporation at Stanford, person in charge of private equity there. The administration at Stanford thought this was a great thing, $200 million. Who would have ever thought of that? When Stanford changed its policies from strict conflict of interest and avoidance of taking equity, they put it all into a fund to support graduate students. Who could disagree with that? Mother and apple pie. But $200 million, well, I'm afraid the graduate students are never going to see all of that. President Hennessy has visions of new buildings, new research programs. But private equity side of Stanford thought it was a failure. A failure, $200 million. Looking at it from their point of view, it should have been a few billion. Because after all, look at the size of the IPO. $200 million is a minute percentage of that. And so in the negotiation with the venture capital industry on Stand Hill Road, they worked out a new formula in which Stanford in the future would increase its percentage of ownership of startups coming out from Stanford. Stanford, in effect, will become a venture capitalist, making an investment in any firm that OTL decides is worthy of pursuing a license for. And on that basis, it will increase the generation of income. You may say it doesn't need more income, it's collecting so much from its alumni, but for academics, and especially academic scientists, there is never such thing as too much income. Everyone always feels poor, no matter how much they have, because the competition increases not only from this country, but from elsewhere. And the entrepreneurial university is generated out of the very nature of the development of the research university in the United States. Because when we imported the research ideal from Germany, we also imported the idea of the research institute. But in this country, in the mid-19th century, there weren't the resources to pay for an institute. So Eben Horsford, chemist at Harvard, he got enough money to build the building, but not enough to heat it, let alone pay the assistants. And so research started by collecting a small amount of money from the university, from private donors, then the foundations in the late 19th and early 20th century, and then the great transformation of World War II, when universities in the Depression refused to take money from government because they feared that control would come. But during the Second World War, when academics proposed the government agencies like OSRD that gave out money, they realized money from the government would be okay if they controlled the distribution. And so the whole peer review system was invented. But what was built up within the universities was entrepreneurial academics to go out and catch these funds from various sources. So when I was doing interviews with biotech firm founders in the 1980s, they would say to me, what I'm doing in forming a firm, it doesn't feel that much different from what I was doing in the university. I was negotiating with program officers, now I'm negotiating with venture capitalists. I was publicizing my research at meetings, now I'm going to speak at investors' meetings. It really feels that when I was in the university, I was really operating a small firm. That's why there wasn't such a gap or distance between the professor in the university and moving outside. And it's also why, contrary to expectations, very few faculty members left the university. They knew that within the university, it would be the source of their second, third, and fourth firms from working with students. And that also is my basic premise as to why students are the competitive advantage of the university. Among all other institutions that produce knowledge, whether it be an R&D unit of a firm or a government research institute, they all tend to ossify and slow down because unless they're growing rapidly, new people don't come in. And so, like in the old Soviet research institutes, they're doing very good work over a 30-year period, but it gets narrower and narrower. New ideas will come out of the universities because we have the flow-through of students. They come in with new ideas, we keep them for a while, we may want to keep them longer, but we have to graduate them. That is why the university is the key institution of a knowledge-based society. And that is why where the R&D units of multinational corporations are located is not very significant, except we see that they're increasingly located in science parks near universities as intelligence units. That's really what they're there for. And to form collaborations, keep an eye on the startups, because after all, how can they really tell as a large firm which is going to be the right one? So even though OTL spends a lot of time marketing, is what they call it, they really delay the startup for about a half year's time until they've gone through all the possibilities. And they usually find out that no large firm is going to license from them. And so eventually, a license to the faculty member or graduate student who's interested in forming the firm. But even at Stanford, the proportion of faculty and students that actually want to go ahead and form a firm is relatively small. And so the US model of entrepreneurial university is a narrow and limited one. And there are other alternatives to this. And so there is developing an entrepreneurial university model in Europe, which is not based on the faculty member, but rather is based on the student. Because the European professor, well, I'm now one, but one is not expected to be an entrepreneur, although it's coming a bit. But the funds are expected to come as a matter of right, connected to the job. Block funding is still the basic source of funding in the UK. So if you want entrepreneurship, which we increasingly do in Europe, we do it by training students as entrepreneurs. In programs such as at Chalmers in Sweden, we take a group of students in with their proposal for a company. We put them through this process of incubation and entrepreneurial training. Some come out with actual companies. Others come out with the experience, which they may use later. So entrepreneurship as an extension of the teaching mission of the university is the emerging European model. And one can also see this in Brazil, where the model has gone much further, in that it's extended throughout the university, not just encapsulated in the business or engineering school. But the premise is that just as in a university, we teach every student how to write a personal essay. We also expect them to write a scientific paper, the rudiments of putting evidence against hypotheses. Well, so should every student learn how to write the basics of a business plan, setting forth objectives and a market test of those objectives. And that is becoming the model in the Brazilian university, firstly at the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, where they've extended it across the university. I like to tell my friends that perhaps they should not have gone as far as they did, because one of the parts of the university, of course, is a theology department. And if they encourage entrepreneurship in the theology department, they may get some unexpected results. Okay, so the competitive advantage of the university we've discussed. The university of the future, I think we'll see incubator facilities, not something off to the side of the campus, but integrated into every department and research center. In the mid-19th century, when the teaching laboratory was invented at the University of Gießen in Germany, it was in a military barracks off to the side of the campus. Today, we wouldn't think of building a science building without the laboratories and the classrooms jointly together. So in the future, I believe we'll see the incubator facility together inside the university. So basically, my overall thesis is that the university is playing a leading role in a knowledge-based society. A shift from the 18th century when industry and government were the two major institutions of society. They were now moving to a triple helix model of university, industry, government relations, in which each of these institutions, in addition to playing their traditional role, are also taking the role of the other. Universities playing some of the role of businesses in forming new firms. Government acting as a venture capitalist in supporting this process. In the United States, well, I once made the mistake of calling a book public venture capital. And I was told, of course, there's no such thing. But if you look at the way many of our programs work, like the Small Business Innovation Research Program, they were designed, and I interviewed them, by the founders to encourage firm formation. But it's done under the guise of supporting research, because we cannot say that government is going to play a direct role in innovation at the federal level. Of course, at the state level, it's something else, because states have the responsibility for job creation. And so at this focal point of intersection between university, industry, and government is where new organizational innovations occur. And so the history of the venture capital firm, it originated in the 1930s and 40s in the Boston region. A collaboration between MIT and Harvard Business School, supported by the financial industry. After making an analysis of the region, that the gap in forming new firms was lack of business advice and seed capital. So they invented this new organizational model to provide that. The point of this story is that there's no single one organizational model to follow. The point is to make an analysis of what are the strengths and weaknesses in your region, and then find a way to fill that gap. I'm now running a think tank in the northeast region of the United Kingdom, which is a declining industrial region. And there's a plan to build a great science park on the old Newcastle brewery site. I can tell you right now, it's a fantasy. It will be a failure. The multinational firms will not locate their R&D units in Newcastle. So how are we going to get it to work? When I was here in Silicon Valley, I visited the Haas School at Berkeley. And there was a professor there, a professor of practice, who basically runs a stable of adjuncts. And so I've transformed the professor of practice idea from a teaching model to a research model. And at Newcastle, we are now hiring professors of practice. The idea is there are people who have done startups, like yourself, but maybe you have an idea for advanced research, which is not appropriate to carry on in the company. But if we offered you a professorship, £100,000 per year, half-time, the idea would be that you might take that position. You'll go and get research funds from the councils, and then you might bring part of your firm along with you to Newcastle. So we just hired our first two professors of practice. One is a molecular modeler who's gotten £500,000 from the Cancer Research Institute and is already talking with our e-business professor, hybridizing new ideas. And so the concept has already gone further than expected. The key issue in the UK will be that everything is done on a small scale. It's thought that if you have 4 professors of practice, well, that's fine, but it needs to be scaled up to 40. If we can do that, I think then the Science City project in Newcastle can be gotten to work, just as Boston, a declining region in the mid-1930s, is now a technological powerhouse and has gone through several generations of technologies. When mini-computers disappeared, the infrastructure was there in Boston in terms of state programs, in terms of venture capital, and so the next reservoir of knowledge in biotechnology was ready to be moved out of the university and now is the core of that region's economy. Thank you.
Well, we began with a look at the global economy, in which Martin concluded by saying location was up for grabs in this knowledge-based economy. More generally, in an unbundled world in which activities become modularized and separated, in which services themselves become transformed by the application of information technology tools and turned into algorithmic problems rather than just personnel problems, the world has changed rather dramatically. And Henry has told us that at the core of this knowledge society, this knowledge economy, is the university. Core to that is the student body, the students who we educate and send out into the rest of the world. And the critical question becomes how it is integrated with industry and government into an operation in the economy, differently in each place, but imaginatively if it's going to be successful. Now we turn to the broader questions in a way, which is that universities also involve citizens, they involve clients students trying to buy their way into universities, they involve roles in the community, that is to buy education by being students in the community. It's only at some of those private universities that people try and buy their way into the university, that they play significant roles in the community as well as in the economy. And Alison Bernstein is going to help us challenge some of our assumptions about the university of the future.
Thank you very much,
you.
John. I've worked at the Ford Foundation too long with PowerPoints to our trustees when the lights go down. Would someone put the lights up, please? I realize that, that I'm here to represent some kind of diversity. I think the diversity I most want to represent has to do with the fact that there are other functions of the university besides its entrepreneurial function. And I think also I want to say that I understand now why the Ford Foundation was invited. First, let me pay tribute to the Carnegie Corporation of America that had the good wisdom to sponsor this event. My colleagues at Carnegie, congratulations, and the wisdom to fund the center more than 50 years ago, depending upon where you date it. I think it's important to tell you that the Ford Foundation beats any entrepreneurial Silicon Valley institution. We founded our office in India in 1952. And therein lies a bit of my set of remarks. I want to talk briefly in 3 sections. The first section is, what do scholars tell us about what these international trends are and where they're taking us? And here I have to give some credit to Phil Altbach and Daniel Levy because of their most recently published book called, I think the title is Private Higher Education, A Global Revolution. Is Phil here? Thank you, Phil. I should say that a lot of this research was actually funded by the Ford Foundation, so we actually use some of the work that we helped to fund. They've written, and others who are part of this compilation, and I urge you to read it, Private Higher Education, A Global Revolution. They talk about many phenomenon, but I'm going to encapsulate it into 3 M's, and I'm not talking about Minnesota mining and manufacturing. The 3 M's that they talk about are McDonaldization. That's a phrase coming out of your book, but I'm going to steal it, Phil. The second one, massification. If it were Henry Ford up here instead of me, he would call it mass production of higher education. And marketization. Those 3 M's that characterize the privatization, the global revolution that has, I think, both positives, but for the purposes of this conversation, some very troubling aspects that I want to associate myself with, not as a scholar, I'm a philanthropist, but by mentioning the fact that the Ford Foundation had an office in India in 1952, I should also mention that the Ford Foundation has an office in China, in Beijing, in Rio de Janeiro, in Brazil. You name one of those countries that Professor Kenny and others have been talking about in the global south, and the Ford Foundation either has been there or is still there. And I can tell you that one of Ford's great contributions has been the development of higher education in virtually any of those places in the world in which we've had a footprint. And since we're 70 years old, we've had a long footprint in many different places. That said, we at Ford feel a little bit like the United States in the following sense. Up until 2005, like the United States, we were the biggest kids in the block in terms of higher education enrollments. But as all of us in this room know, since 2005, higher education enrollments in China surpassed the United States, and higher education enrollments in India are right behind us. So we're sandwiched, the United States is sandwiched between the massifications of both China and India. The important figure, though, to remember is that our higher education enrollments represent roughly 50% of the traditional age cohort. China's enrollments represent about 20% of that cohort of traditionally aged students, and by that I don't want to suggest for a minute that they're the only students we ought to concern ourselves with, but just sticking with that. And India's represents only 10% of the traditional age cohort. So India is on an upward curve of massification and marketization and McDonald'sization in a lot of ways. And I think one of the things that we all ought to talk about is what those words mean. Sitting in Berkeley, and I'm delighted to say she is here, I always remember Pat Cross, K. Patricia Cross, and want to pay tribute to her because she was one of the first scholars to talk about student-centered learning. One of my fears at the moment around the 3 M's is that there's been a perversion, and I'm going to use that word, a perversion of student-centered learning to suggest that the only way we need to think about students is as consumers, to whom we bring markets. They are markets. We look to them. We fill our coffers, especially those institutions in the global north, and also as future corporate employees. And those are the only 2 ways we talk about these students, either as consumers or as corporate employees of the future. I'd like to suggest that there's a 3rd C, M's and C's, and the 3rd C is students as citizens, and that we do higher education a terrible disservice if we don't think about students as citizens in democratic societies or societies moving in a democratic, enhanced manner. So let me just get to this privatization question and unpack it a little bit. Phil and Daniel were not as critical as I'm going to be for the purposes of this comment, but I have 3 questions of privatization. The first, there's no real distinction that I've been able to get from the researchers between private higher education outside the US and Western Europe that is profit-making or nonprofit. I think we need to understand that distinction. Is it a distinction with a difference? Does it make any difference? You know, in the Philippines, higher education institutions are part of the stock market. So privatization can be either for-profit or nonprofit. In the United States, for 3 centuries, private universities were nonprofit, for the most part. Now we have the University of Phoenix and others, which are private universities that are profit-making. So a question for the researchers, help us understand what this privatization is all about. Because I fear it's all about finding markets and exploiting them. By the way, I have not yet run across, in my work at the Ford Foundation, an institution from the global south that is colonizing American students and American markets. So for me, the topic of globalization is, I think, one to question. It feels more like colonization and less like globalization. Second point I would ask of this privatization phenomenon, which I believe is a phenomenon, is the access question. What kinds of students are attending these institutions? Now, in Brazil, where we also have an office, there's been some research to suggest that these institutions not only are out there, either local or indigenous or coming from other parts of the world, but they're out there and they're especially exploiting the poorest students. I'd like to understand the socioeconomic categories of the students who are going into private higher education in the rest of the world. And if there is data that suggests that it actually is costing those students more than if the universities, which are public, were more willing and more able to develop alternative systems of, in fact, enrollment and retention, that would interest me as well. And last but not least, what is this privatization doing to gender inequalities? There has been some interesting research that suggests that in the Middle East and in parts of Asia, a number of universities are becoming women-only universities. And one wants to ask the question, isn't that a good phenomenon? Well, yes, if it's giving access to women for the first time, but yes, with a question mark, namely, access to what kinds of careers? Are we still in a sex-stereotyped career pattern when those women who are needed to be teachers or social workers or nurses? So for me, this privatization question needs to be very much unpacked. That's the first part of my remarks. Second part. Well, I work at the Ford Foundation, so I'm a philanthropist, and I need to tell you what we do about this phenomenon of globalization and the trend. And I'm going to give you 3 quick examples, and then I'll be glad to answer any questions that you might have in the Q&A. The first example is that not long ago, actually after 2000, when our finances were doing rather well, we discovered that we could make an important contribution by creating a completely portable fellowship for postgraduate study for students who have the baccalaureate from institutions in the countries in which we work. And we created something called the International Fellowships Program with $280 million. And we've just added more money to this program, and it's characterized by 3 phenomena. One is complete portability. It's not like the Fulbrights. And it's not like the Gates's fellowships that go straight to Cambridge. Complete portability, in my judgment, recognizes that higher education around the world can serve these students. They need not only come to the United States. The second part of this program is that it isn't for PhD study, though students can begin their PhD studies. It's for interdisciplinary study in the fields where their countries and their societies have the greatest need. So it might be around the environment. It might be around human rights. It could be around education itself. But the idea is not to fit into any particular academic disciplinary box per se. And the last thing about the fellowships, and this for me is the most important, it is for students coming from groups which have been historically underrepresented in the higher education systems of their countries. So let me give you an example. In Mexico, the International Fellowships Program is focused almost exclusively on indigenous peoples. True also in Peru. In Brazil, Afro-Brazilians. So around the world. In Russia, interestingly enough, you have to come from a city outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. Okay, so it's not just about racial identity or ethnic identity. It has to do with whether or not your region or the people that you have over the years been a part of have been underrepresented. Second point about our work internationally has to do with a program called Pathways. And this is an effort to accompany this fellowships program with institutional transformation around populations that have been poorly served. And the last one, which I think you probably heard a little bit about last night because Narciso Martos from Carnegie is involved, there are 6 foundations that are doing a partnership for African higher education. We're together spending $200 million. And I think it's fair to say that this partnership goes from making broadband accessible, so there is a technology fix that we're interested in, to also enhancing the roles and access for women in Africa to university-based education. Let me end quickly now by saying, what is my worry? And the worry I have can be, if you will, summarized by saying citizenship. What is the role of universities of the future in educating people to be informed citizens of their respective societies and to have some informed knowledge of the world? A few of those topics lend themselves to particular activities that I want to put on the table. The first is, if universities, business, and government get more closely aligned, what does that do to academic freedom and to the role of the university as the challenger of the status quo, not just the participant in either governmental or business-designed agendas? Secondly, the question of participatory governance. How do universities make their decisions, and will the university of the future be as careful as it needs to be about the role of the faculty? I worry about that given the, let's call it, more logical but also problematic liaisons between government, business, and academia. Let me end then with an anecdote. Not long ago, I spent an entire Saturday from morning till midnight seeing the play The Coast of Utopia, which is a play by the British author Tom Stoppard, but he's actually Czechoslovakian. So he's a Czech by way of Britain, and now it's playing in New York. And one of the most moving things about this play was it begins with a bunch of university students. Now, these university students were probably more constructive than Mario Savio and his gang here in the free speech movement at Berkeley. But I do think, and this is important, I do think Berkeley is an icon for issues of free speech and citizenship. And it does strike me that the role of the university in helping people not just to be consumers or corporate employees, but also imaginers of a different kind of future cannot be lost, need not be lost in the university of the future. But I worry that we're paying too much attention to some of those other functions and not enough to the function of providing societies with informed, democratically leaning citizens. So I will leave you with a French feminist quote: "I hope the future is not what it was." Thank you.
2 seconds. Alison Bernstein has done a wonderful job of taking us from the confines of the economy via the student, asking what, in fact, that means for the student to be at the center of the university, because they're also not only an economic fixture, but a social fixture, a citizen fixture in our societies. And I think she raises some very important questions. One that I would like to just remark on in this transition is that this notion of what privatization in the university means, the private for profit and the private for nonprofit, is a very basic question that goes beyond the university, which is we've gone from a society in which the public objectives were pursued through administration to a world in which we now try and pursue, often very effectively, many of those public purposes through markets. And therefore the question becomes, under what circumstances are administrations abusive, under what circumstances are markets abusive, and in what ways can one in fact effectively use markets as mechanisms of accomplishing public purposes? I think the question is very basic, and I think it's really part of the shift from the 19th to the 21st century.
Agreed. It's not just about higher education alone, obviously.
Obviously. But that was your lead into the subject. So, now I want to turn to John Gage, who will give us the view of the wandering scholar.
Well, thank you. I wanted to comment. I probably should begin with a quotation from a professor of physics who stood on the Sproul Hall steps and said, "You know, I don't think that we should regard students, as Alison said, as simply in a pathway to employment by a corporation." That was the "do not fold, bend, spindle, or mutilate" speech by Mario Savio, who took to account the views of education promulgated in the 60s, characterized by many as instrumental. We're going to create in you carrier of knowledge, but technical knowledge, into companies. Well, I'm an example of what Mario Savio said we shouldn't be doing. In some sense, I went to Berkeley and with some Berkeley students started a computer company. We started it in 1982, 20 years after the 60s. And in doing that, we drew upon, in 1982, global resources. And when we started, as it turned out, the four major founders of Sun unfortunately named a company. As it turned out by accident, we utilized technologies built at Stanford for the Stanford University Network, so the acronym from Stanford maintained, even though all the heart and soul of what we do came from Berkeley. So our simple analysis at the time was, how do you raise money for a company? Berkeley University Network, Bunn Microsystems, didn't have a lot of appeal, so we named it after Stanford. So that's, now, when you think about that time, the 60s to the 80s, the time of all of the Silicon Valley investment, which yielded a lot of money, remember there's always a 20, 30, 40-year time lag in this. So every investment made in the 40s and 50s in linking knowledge of how to make a semiconductor or a circuit board turned into the 70s and 80s Fairchilds, which turned into money back to Stanford and to Berkeley and to Xerox, turned into 80s and 90s money, which came back. Andy Bechtolsheim, German, Technical University of Munich, Sun employee number 1, managed to invest a few $100,000 in Larry and Sergey, graduate students, and that turned into about $6 billion return. So this constant cycling of knowledge acquaintanceship that has yielded this productive environment we call Silicon Valley, Stanford, Berkeley, or Berkeley, Stanford University. You know, the nexus we're in this very fortunate part of the world is now moving. So that's what I wanted to talk a little bit about. And you saw the numbers that Martin put up. I can amplify them a little bit. But we're watching for the next 20 years quite a change. And so at the same time that the 6 Foundation Frontiers in Africa consortium with $20 million meeting in Cape Town in November went through with 21 vice chancellors of the African universities, how important it was to link them together simply so they could exchange information, put them on the internet, something we take for granted. Those vice chancellors had been fighting hand to mouth for money in Mozambique, Moi University, Nairobi University, each of the universities, just to keep it together. The thought that you could have high bandwidth links that would enable classes, information, journal access, all of the components of collaborative research enabled by a high-speed interconnection, they just weren't, it wasn't on their radar. As Alison, it's fair to say, it just wasn't on their priority list in some way. They were attempting, but it changed because of that meeting brought together by the 6 foundations. But the money, there's no money. So in contrast, think of China. At this moment, the only 400 universities in China, the only pure, this is a little weird, Internet Protocol version 6, which is the new way that internet packets are addressed. Every end device has a unique address. If every end device has a unique address, you can write applications that would monitor every sensor in this building for energy use or water use or seismic activity. You can create complete new applications. The only pure IPv6 network in the world, and a very high-speed one, is linking 400 universities in China, not here. So now, of course, the government loves the network in which every endpoint in the network is identified uniquely. Ah, this is good. Ah, we now know. Those Berkeley people that get up and send faxes to China to cause trouble during the Tiananmen Square. My God, we've got their return address now, so we know where they are. So there are aspects in this technical change that are important. So I thought I'd steal from the very first, when Grant said, the wandering scholar's an old phenomenon, I looked in this room. Look at all the wanderers. Every person in this room has just gotten off the plane in the last week or two. Everyone in this room is moving from place to place. Everyone is living this life of interchange at a global level of information. Behind the scholars lie the upcoming generations of scholars, which we, as industrials, will try to hire. And then I like this phrase, what is a hanging offense? What was the hanging offense? We heard, I wrote down some quotes here. Sheldon said, well, aside from many universities would be pleased if their faculty would stay home for a while, he said that in his age, the hanging offense was cheating. The ethic of the faculty said, this is how you do things. There are ways that you do things. We, the faculty, will give you guidance. Don't take that course. We won't say it publicly because we have to go to the faculty club and sit next to the person we just thought was an idiot, but we give guidance, and there are standards, and there are standards in your work, and that's what it means to rise in the scholarly profession as a scholar. Trust and truth. Being able to publish things and see things. So I subtitled my talk, What's a Hanging Offense in the Era of the Internet? Because suddenly things we didn't think could happen, students with cell phones in an examination exchanging text messages, or the phenomenon, notice no one here does what you'll find in an engineering or a business meeting. No one here has on their lap an internet-connected device that lets them check the veracity of the statements made by the speakers at the podium. So I did a quick check. I can appear to know this. I had no clue. When Ford says that in '52 we were in India and you poor computer people were nowhere, I go back to, which I just discovered, Henry Ford driving out the 20th million Ford vehicle that he sold in 1931. So 31 to 52, it's 21 years it took Ford to find their way to India, even with an enormous amount of money, you know, so there are, we barely got going when the, you know.
It took Ford almost 20 years to go from Dearborn, Michigan to New York City. I just want to make that point.
All right. A long walk, a long walk. If only those, just crank that Model A. That's our view of these things. So I thought, okay, so if I'm going to talk about the environment we're facing, and there's a monetary side, and I'll show you something in a second about some good news, but it's more in the world of, oh my God, here we're all linked, and what's that mean for, will everyone doing scientific research be forced to allow their complete data sets to be seen by other people? Seems sort of in the spirit of scientific research. Let's look across the faculty and find who fight that tooth and nail. Can the journals begin to require that there are revelations about personal links between those publishing and the, let's say, the pharmas as an instance, or these things in the last week or two about every doctor out there is on the payroll? All these elements, which are now becoming more and more prevalent in what we do day to day, are enabled in some sense by, we could call it the Wikipedias or the ability to cruise around the internet, or the Google, something that lets us discover things which in the past were hard to find and now are quite easy to find. So I made a tiny list. I think this may still be too small, so I'll make it a bigger once again. All right. Here's a little list. I just, for fun, 10-centimeter imagery. What's that mean? That means that the Google twins, Larry and Sergey, graduate students, each worth $10 or $12 billion, said that they'd spend a couple of $100 million of Google's money to enable Google Earth to have pictures at 10 to 20 centimeter resolution of the entire surface of the Earth. Which means that our kids and our kids' kids are going to have a very different attitude about what you can see and what you can't see and where you go and what's visible. If you cut a tree down in Cameroon, in the past you could do it with impunity, and now you can see the pictures. So global deforestation takes on a new immediacy when you can see it. 1 meter location data, 1 millimeter locational data. I didn't know this until Richard Newton and I were attempting to put a program together to take a survey of every structure in Berkeley. From the roof of the Berkeley City Hall, there's an antenna. They receive the GPS signals, as your telephones, some of them do, that locates you with about 10 or 20 meter accuracy. They compute the error in the PC at Berkeley City Hall that says, we're here, the satellite stuff says we're over there, we compute the error, and we send it out by radio across all of Berkeley so that a differential GPS unit can tell you where you are with millimeter accuracy. This is very interesting for contractors who are supposedly obeying what they said they'd do in repairing your kitchen by moving the wall over a foot. It's now marked, located, millimeter, well, 10 millimeter accuracy in locating anything on the surface of the Earth. This is new. We've never had that before. Spies have had it a little bit, but not so much. The ubiquitous communication, cell phones in the examination room, people linking constantly to flows of information. I put in virtual immersive environment. I'll show you in just a second, but there's a bunch of kids in San Francisco that created this imaginary game world called Second Life, where your avatar wanders around, meets others. IBM has almost 2,000 engineers every day taking courses on the IBM islands inside Second Life. Why? Because, I don't know how you'd say this, psychoactively, but not quite right. The psychological impact of seeing John's avatar, distinguished, white-haired, slim. There you are in a meeting with other people. It's not them, it's their avatar, but your brain believes you're really there. It's an experience at a lower cortex level, below the cortex, of you're being there, you're around with other people. The TED conference last week, very lauded in the New York Times, brought 1,000 people into a room and brought thousands of people not in the room, virtually there, to experience this environment. This is something we've never had before. So, 5 minutes, okay, so I'll show you. So what's the environment coming up? That's the environment. It's something I made I thought I'd do a little show and tell here. So here we are. This is just the Google Earth thing that any kid can now reach. And if I say, let's fly, so we come down on us, and imagine the imagery is, 10 centimeter imagery, which means we can see your bicycle parked outside the building. And then from the Lippmann room, right there, we can go off to other places in the world which are very close to us. And for an example, I decided to go from here to a long view out from, as we see from the balcony here, and then let's just head over to Nicasio, to Mozambique. Why don't we go to Mozambique? Let's come down. I'm a little wrong on where the university is, but there we're in Maputo, and I can go down in the same ease and have a sense. I can zoom down on bicycles on the campus. And now I've discovered that what I ought to really pay attention to, I'm wrong, aren't I, about where the university is? I think I'm a little wrong, but you'll tell me. You'll get me the right act. So, but there we are, we zoom down, and now I've discovered that I really need to pay attention to a place I'd never thought much about, but with a 100,000-pound offer, I think we ought to spend some time in Newcastle, don't you? So, where's my office? These kinds of things are, this is interesting because suddenly, there's a little project. Let's attempt to make this individual to individual feeling stronger. Let's go put a dot on the map, meter accurate, centimeter accurate, meter accurate, for every one of the 3 million schools in the world. Not hard. 2 grad students could do it in a week, roughly. Just find a clump of buildings, probably an elementary school, put it up. Take the official numbers, they're all wrong. I did it for California. The state has no clue. Well, it's a longer story, but...
That's a full statement.
Just stop. Okay. So this stuff is in the future university because research, anybody doing data set acquisition without adding spatial coordinates to the location of the sensors, not going to happen anymore. Everything's going to be spatially centered. We're going to be able to do that. As a result of a number of academy studies, this is Rising Above the Gathering Storm, a number of others. Yesterday, it turns out that the Democrats are saying that they're going to try to jump up investment, and here's the language, sense of the House, funding, nation continuing to be world leader, interesting, in innovation, education, innovation again, wow, this is a hastily put together document. Budget resolution, $450 million above President's requested level for 2008 and subsequent. It goes on about energy and employment and education, our greatest resource for innovations in the classrooms. So here, number 3 in the let's get on with it part of this report says let's get 100,000 new scientists, engineers, and mathematicians, and let's pay the teachers and get them into the K-12s and get, so it goes on, and there's a long document behind this. So this is up for battle in the next couple of days. Overall, the proposal coming in in Washington is to really significantly increase investment with this drumbeat of, if we don't, the innovation goes away, and the venture capitalists and the Silicon Valley guys and all this will continue to move overseas. So, what's the truth in that? Well, there is some truth in that. I just went through the budget figures for us. We have about 400 engineers and another 1,000 people in Bangalore. We're going to move it up to 1,200 in the research lab in Bangalore. We have about 500 engineers, research engineers in Beijing. We're going to move it to about 1,500. We're not going to increase the research facilities in either Cambridge or in Massachusetts or in the Bay Area. Why? It's really expensive. And so everybody's moving anyway, just as a data point. We've said to every employee, 35,000 of them at Sun, you now all live virtually. You're on the net, you're working, you can be anywhere you want to work. Why don't you go live in Beijing? You'll keep your US salary for a year. We'll get a little antsy if you try to stay much longer than that, and at which point we will decline your salary way, way down to the Chinese level. But if your family's at a state where you think it's a good thing for your kids to learn to speak Mandarin fluently, you can as easily live in Beijing as in California because all the networks there, we have gigabit networks running around, the apartments are very nice, and you're going to be required to do one thing, which is go sit at lunch with a bunch of Chinese engineers. Remember, there are more English speakers in China than there are in the US and England and all combined. Australia, throw in Australia, because people study English, but they don't speak it. They can read, but they can't speak. So that's the price for a Sun employee going to live in Beijing, is you must speak. So we're building an environment for higher education that's a mixture of human beings getting across the network into collaborative environments where your work can be shared and you can learn to deal with people. We've always learned in all of this, unless you go have lunch with somebody, you don't know their sense of humor. So John's going to throw me off the stage in a second, but I know he's joking. So we're going to, so.
We're actually past the stop point.
Okay, well, then all right, I'll do 2 minutes and I'll stop, I promise. So lurking in this are the movements at Berkeley or at MIT or at the IITs or at Tsinghua. How do the elite universities of the world, the research universities, the generators of the most talented people, and from our point of view, a big company, we're a pretty big company, you have this, you need one smart person, a Bill Joy, say, and then around them you need 100 or maybe 1,000 people to answer the phone and keep the lights on. But that one person establishes a field that really changes things. They're usually a pain in the ass, and you have to get a lot of people to deal with them and so forth. But that significant innovation, Joy at the moment's working on desalination. If you could imagine a breakthrough in desalination, think of the transformation in the next 25 years as global warming begins to cause mosquitoes to come and crops to die and so forth. We have these issues about where are we going to find the money and how are we going to find the alliance. The British Petroleum deal here, well, the academic senate meeting seemed moderately quiet about the whole thing, but I think they're in for $500 million. There are a lot of others that are out there attempting to find places. Think of it, Chevron, just 3 weeks ago, the funders of all the fake science, anti-global warming think tanks got up and said, we're actually changing our mind here. We've got to find some money to put into at least amelioration of the bad stuff coming. So this these issues with billions at Qatar, billions in Dubai, and their desire to create institutions that we think should be supported, we've got to find out how we deal with that. Back to the issue of the ethics that Carl brought up. The faculty's in charge. The faculty reviews those that would like to join the faculty to see if they have the ethical and scholarly capabilities. And if they pass the bar, then how do they influence that tiny community to push these standards out into this expanding, suddenly shrunken, connected world? So with that, I was going to show you one last thing, and then I promise I'll stop. And here it is. Where is it? This is a way that I have found extraordinary. This is about 3 days old, so you'll have to, there we go. And then we do this. I was going to show you that Glendale Community College thinks that Berkeley has a language requirement for chemistry. Remember when it was German? Everyone had to have German. Sorry, that's 30, 50 years ago. So what I want to show you is this. Two things. One, Wikipedia list. What languages are there that people do things in? And this is the list in order. There's the big ones. So they're the big ones. English, 1,000,007 articles in Wikipedia. German second at 562. French is bringing up 466. Polish is 362. And it goes on. And when you look at the list of what they are, oops, it goes down like this. The first African language, here's the ordering. English, German, French, bringing up number 23 is Hebrew, bringing up number 34 is Telugu, coming down here. We haven't hit an African language yet. We keep going down here, Latin, Sicilian in at 61, and Marathi, we're keeping going. At about 100, we get here we have Kiswahili, 93. So, how many pages in that encyclopedia are there? 8,000. I stopped. All right. So my reason I show you this is that this globalization has this impediment where the local languages are not in the game, and there's a massive and quick way to change this. And then the last thing I put on the screen is this. This is how we're going to be able, in a scholarly way, to allow the data to be shown. This is UN DP and a variety of UN data. This is an animation of, in this case, income, the movement of the great big red thing, that's China. And the little guys are the other countries. And this shows a 60-year time series, and you can pick whether it's level of education or infant mortality or whatever. This ability to suddenly take scholarly data and see the path, and in every path there is a story. If I go back to the beginning and I pick, or I just choose to pick, let's say Mozambique here, we just put this up a couple of weeks ago. Here's Mozambique's story. There's Mozambique, boop. And we say, now Mozambique, I'd like to see you, let's see if I just unclicked it. Let's watch your path, Mozambique, over this period of time. How did you do on income, getting richer to the right, and on life expectancy? Not so good. And if we take a look, for example, at South Africa, it's the last thing I'll show you. Here's South Africa. So South Africa, they're checked. Let's watch South Africa's movement getting, can we see them? No, I've got to go back a little bit. There's South Africa. Watch it play out over the last 25 years of data. Richer, that's more life expectancy headed down. So you can just get a sense in 10 seconds of all these things we've been talking about. How do countries change? What makes the change? At what point was that sudden decline? And there's a story there, if you probe, that lets you see what the role of the universities can be in finding those moments when countries are going down like this or going up and changing the trajectory of the lives of the citizens. So I'll stop with that.
Since we don't have much time, I'll just be really brief. About India, and I wish I could ask it to Professor Kenny, but maybe you would have, Mr. Gage, a comment. My problem, having watched Indian higher education for 40 years, is I wrote an article which was titled Tiny at the Top. I mean, the quality sector in Indian higher education is extremely small. And do you guys think that you're going to run into a severe problem of not just numbers of graduates, but the quality of graduates who can work in your and other firms there real quick? I could go on, but I won't.
The answer is yes. When we started Vinod Khosla, IIT Delhi, employee number 8 or 9, IIT Mumbai, or another one, IIT Kanpur, the most boring, interminable discussions laced with Indian metaphysics, wasted so much time about the quality distinctions between the IITs. So few people come out of those schools, and they're world-class, I mean, unbelievably good schools. At the moment, the 80,000 employees of Infosys, drawn from India, sorry, there aren't enough Indians to fill the slots for Infosys. They're opening a lab as of a month and a half ago in Malaysia so they can hire people from the Science University in Malaysia and a number of other places. So everybody in India is feeling this enormous disparity between the very elite and wonderful IITs and then the huge drop-off in quality. So that's why you'll see in Andhra Pradesh and other places serious investment in this next level, a lot of business schools and so forth. But China did a much better job in, and if you look in, I was just in Chengdu, 13 universities in Chengdu. I must say, and a number of chancellors are in the room, that Berkeley does not look as good as Chengdu. The lecture halls, the facilities for the students they spent a lot of money. And there's a significant state council realization that that level of investment is going to yield, and they're quite confident of it, very Chinese confident. China will inevitably lead in all of these areas. And so you United States people can catch up if you want. Now, it's not true in pure science, but in engineering, there's an enormous impetus in coming from this next level of very good universities.
It's not often realized, but the IITs, which are considered the elite of universities in India, are basically teaching colleges at a very high level that are just beginning now to get into research, hiring in researchers from industry. Basically, they're at the transition stage that MIT was in the late 19th century. But we tend at a meeting like this to focus at the upper level elite universities. I think it's very important to look at this question of why are these private for-profit universities appearing in such numbers all across the developing world, from Mexico to India and elsewhere. Well, I was recently offered a job, a part-time job at a private university in Brazil. So I had an opportunity to meet with the leadership of this university and discuss with them things like who their students are. In Brazil, the elite go to public universities. The people lower down go to the state universities, and then at the bottom, from the favelas, coming out of the slums, you go to the private universities. And the private universities the for-profit privates play a very significant role in getting people the first rung out of poverty. And they specifically realize that this is their mission. So they tend to focus on computer science, business, but also in new innovative areas like in agriculture. They have a concept of this particular university, which is near one of the huge favelas, of giving students a training and you send them out with what they call business in a box. That is the elements of a business in a particular technical area developed in the university that you can train large numbers of students in. So they are playing the role that the community colleges traditionally played in California, but with a difference. The community colleges like De Anza trained the huge numbers of programmers that make Silicon Valley work. The bottom end, you couldn't have had that huge increase in programming without training everyone from PhDs to high school dropouts. The private universities in the developing world are playing a similar role to community colleges in the United States, and therefore, I would argue should be supported and encouraged rather than downgraded and denigrated.
Just to make life a little more interesting, I would say one of the problems with that model is that the public universities, which are heavily subsidized, are serving the wealthiest students. That's certainly true in Brazil. And therefore, as a matter of public policy, it shouldn't be the case that the poorest students have to pay the most to get that kind of education. The difference between those private universities in Brazil and Foothill de Anza is at least Foothill de Anza doesn't charge the level of tuition that the private universities are charging. So I don't think I think it's a useful comparison in terms of the training. I don't think it's a useful comparison in terms of social policy. We're done.